Alright everyone, so I'm going to have a quick lecture here for you about integrating sources. So let me pull that up real quick. So integrating sources is really important, and it's important that you do it right and you do it well. So we're going to start with why we use sources. Essentially, sources add credibility to your argument. So if I'm going to make an argument about why we should use hybrid cars, if I don't own a hybrid car, but I'm yelling and screaming about why everyone should have one, I'm less likely to be believed than if I either own one or if I pull in evidence from research or other people who own hybrid cars that say hybrid cars are great because X, Y, and Z. So we have a lot of different things we're going to talk about here, starting with works cited. So when you have a citation for a quote from research, works cited are really simple, and they're not difficult like a lot of people think they are. So when we have a citation, we don't put numbers. So this is your bibliography page. Use what's called a hanging indent to separate them. And this got a little bit messed up, but essentially what you're going to do is, actually I'll go back in so you can see. You will have something like this. And what it'll look like is a works cited looks like this, where you have the author's last name and page number author's last name as the starting point, and you left align that. And if it goes to one line, then you're done. If it goes to two or more lines, what you do is you go down to the second line and you indent any lines that follow for that citation. If I had another citation, so say this was only a 2-line citation, I would go in and say I had a different person. See, it messes up every time, I apologize. But say I had a different person, I would go in and make a space, and then I would write the next person's name. So it would be, say, Tarrington John. And then I would continue on with my citation. But so that way you could see how a works cited looks. You have a citation with an indent on any lines that follow the first line, and then you go on, you make a space, and then you go to the second one. And so that is what a basic works cited page will look like. There's a lot of resources that can help you with works cited pages. EasyBib is one that a lot of people use. Purdue OWL works really well to help you understand different citations and how you should format them. But essentially you put them in alphabetical order by last name, and then you want to make sure that you abbreviate things like dates. I'm sorry, not dates, but things like months in citation, but only if they have a month that is naturally longer than 5 letters. So something like September would be shortened, whereas May would not. And then we're going to talk about this, but works cited is different than works consulted. So works consulted essentially is just information that you might have read over briefly, but you're not necessarily directly using in your argument. A works cited is anything that you put in your paper. So if it's on your works cited page, it has to be used directly in your argument. That's really important because a lot of people will have an argument without any citations, and without any in-text citations or quotes or anything, and then they'll put something on a works cited page because they have to. That's not the point of it. We really want you to make sure that you're using the works cited to do sources that have contributed to your argument. An in-text citation is just as important as the works cited. In fact, I'd say it's almost even more important, because when you're having an argument, you have to attribute anything that is an idea, a phrase, a word, a sentence, anything that comes from someone else. You need to make sure that they get the credit for it. So it's really simple in text. When you have a citation, you're going to do last name and page number in parentheses. So for example, Smith 249. Note that there's no comma. If you don't have a name, you can use the title or a few words from the title. So you don't have to put necessarily the whole title, but just a brief shortened version of the title. If there's no page number, you leave it out. And again, if you use the author's name at the beginning of the sentence, so you say John Smith says blah, 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 you don't have to put it again at the end. You just put 249. And then it always goes in front of the period. So your period would be right here after the end parentheses. The only difference is a block quote, and we'll get to that. So here's some examples of in-text citations that you can look at. Note that they're all a little bit different. One of these has the page number, one's just an article, one, so it has no page number. One has the integrated source, so according to Patricia Smith, blah, 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 so we don't have to put her name. And then we have the same thing here, so you can look over that in your own time. And here's a little exercise that you can look at. What's the problem with these in-text citations? So the first one, essentially, you'll look, there is no page number. And the second one, we have no author attributed right here. And the third one, we have no author or article title attributed, so it says just an article. So you can look over that. Signal phrases. So signal phrases are really important, and every sort of instructor has their kind of pet peeve, and for me, this is mine. Signal phrases mean that you can't have a quote just by itself. You have to have one or two words that either lead into or lead out of the quote. So a lot of what we call signal phrases or leads-ins have a comma or colon that follows. So it's something like, according to the article, blah, comma, and then you have the quote. Or you could do something like the author. You could say, according to John Smith, comma, and then you have your quote. You could do it in the opposite way too. You could say, it is very important to, quote, eat healthy every day, end quote, according to John Smith. So all of these are just situations where that you see that you have to have a signal phrase on either the beginning or the end of the sentence. And then a couple of lead-ins or signal phrases don't require a comma, just because of the way that it's formulated, usually with the word that. All right, titles. Titles are tricky, but not really too complicated. You italicize magazines, newspapers, books, basically longer publications, film or TV series as well. If you have a shorter work, which we call shorter even if it is like 50 pages, something like an article, that will be in quotation marks. So this is all kinds of articles. These are journal articles, newspaper articles, chapters also from books, so individual chapters, and even episodes from a TV series would all be in quotation marks. All right, after you have your lead-in and your quote, you need an explanatory sentence. You can't just leave a quote by itself. You have to explain why the quote shows what you're talking about. This is, you don't want to leave it implicit for your audience, which means you don't leave it up to them to put the two together. You make it explicit, meaning you tell them, this is how this quote proves what I'm talking about. And that really is just part of good argumentation, because there's a chance your audience may not put two and two together, and that's, it's kind of up to you as the author to make sure they do. So the pattern really is a lead-in, the information, the quote, the paraphrase, whatever it is, and then a follow-up explanation. And there's some good information in your packets that you guys can look at. So I've given you some example lead-ins and follow-up here that you can kind of look over on your own. And I'll give you some answers. So quotations. There's basically three kinds of quotes. There's a paraphrase, there's a direct quote, and there's a block quote. And a lot of times students get confused about what has to be cited. Anything that is any of these three must be cited in text and on your bibliography as a source. So a paraphrase basically is where you take information and you put it in your own words. So this is usually if you have a lot of information or something that's not easily quotable, you'll put it as a paraphrase. And you absolutely must cite this because it's someone else's idea, and if you don't, it's plagiarism. So it gives you an example here. According to Patricia Smith, the Supreme Court is wrestling with blah, 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 blah. That's not a direct quote from her, but you're basically taking her information and putting it back in your own words. Paraphrases are good evidence, but they're not as powerful or strong as a direct quote, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So a direct quote basically takes information exactly from your source, and what you're doing is by giving that direct quote, you're giving credence or power to the ideas and the words of others that add to your own argument. So a direct quote is very simple. You already know exactly what this is. You use a quotation marks, and then you have your citation. Sometimes you have to do a quote within a quote, and I've talked about this in the basics document. This is where you're going to use those single quotes within double quotes. So if you need a reminder of that, go back to your basics document, but essentially you start out with the double quote, and then in the middle you put the single quote where it's the other person's quote. And I know that can be complicated. If you have questions about that, let me know, and I'll be happy to try and explain it. Okay, Block quotes. A lot of students try to do block quotes, and sometimes they quite honestly do it just to eat up space. And you don't want to do this. You only use block quotes, and they're very rare, quite honestly. You only use them if you have 4 or more lines when it's typed out. So to do it, you end your sentence with a colon. I'm going to show you an example in a second. You'll hit enter. You'll start a new paragraph. You'll align the quote all together with an indent. Give the quote in single space. This is where a lot of students sometimes try to eat up space. It's not double spaced. A block quote must be single spaced. You don't use quotation marks, but you still do put the citation as necessary. Then you hit enter and you start back on the left align. So here's an example for you. It says Neen Dali blah blah. Nellie Dean does this, and then here's your colon, and then you single space and indent the block quote, and then you go back to your type regular. All right, a few punctuation things, and I did go over all this in your basics document, but ellipses basically show that information is missing from a quote. You don't put them at the end of a quote to signal that it's the end of a quote. A lot of students do this by accident, and it's a lot of people do this by accident. You only use it to indicate that there's missing information. Brackets are used basically to show that you made a change that was necessary to the quote just for understanding. So if you had to put in a different word because your tense is different than the tense of the quote, that would work. So if you had to say, if the quote was in past tense and you needed to make it present, you had to change was to is. You would put is in a bracket in place of was. And then lastly, sick is used to indicate that something is actually an error in the original material, but you're reprinting it knowing that it's an error. So basically use this for misspellings or misprintings. So here's an example. It just gives you an example of all the punctuations, and you can kind of look over it for yourself, but here's sick, and here's where you put the brackets, and here's the ellipses that are information that's missing, blah, blah, blah. So basically that is it. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, go ahead and move on to your next assignment.